They said Josiah Calder died in his sleep. That was the polite version. The truth smelled like cottonseed and lamp oil. On a windless September night in 1867, the richest planter in Grafton County was found face down on the gin house floor with his spectacles pressed into his cheek and the watch he swore by stopped at 3:13. The coroner wrote apoplexy. The hands wrote nothing. Men who had worked the gin since boyhood stared at the dark groove the body left in lint and decided without saying it that a house that devours a man will ask for seconds. His widow walked into that silence and made it stand. Temperance Calder was 38, a war-made widow with a waist like a wasp and a mouth that never hurried. She wore mourning the way soldiers wear medals, precisely to be seen. On the morning after the funeral, she unlocked Josiah's ledger with the brass key she kept at her throat and turned to a clean page. She wrote a single line that made the book colder to touch. Succession will be by blood. Then underneath it, a second line that no one but the clerk was allowed to read. Husband's duties, redistributed. This is not a love story. It is not even, strictly speaking, a ghost story, though there were nights when the Calder clock struck 13 and the house swore it was only 12. It is the kind of story that keeps a county's mouth shut for 150 years and then cracks open all at once when some idiot starts digging a new drainage ditch. Before we go down into the rooms the family never named, do one thing for me. If you are listening in the dark, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because stories like this, stories stitched out of rumors, receipts, and rooms built below rooms, deserve witnesses. After the war, cotton came back meaner. The Calder Place 1,900 acres of loam cut by a Blackwater Creek ran on debt, praise, and fear. Temperance understood all three. She cut the hands rations to make the notes and cut the preacher's check to make the praise. As for fear, that she cultivated the way other women cultivated roses. It began with a supper that no one called a wake. 3 place settings at the head of the table, 3 chairs where there had been one. Temperance's sons were grown enough to wear their father's coats. Thaddeus, 24, with hands like hammers. Rowan, 22, all bone and brightness. And Eli, 19, the youngest, still catching up to his shadow. Adults, all of them, and yet they sat wrong in the candlelight, as if the chairs had secrets and the wood could sting. Grafton County grieves, Temperance said, lifting her glass. And yet the house must not. The house must eat and breathe and be obeyed. She looked at each son long enough to make the seconds ache. You will hold what your father held. You will keep what he kept. You will not let what was ours fall to mouth or flame. On paper, she added almost playfully, tapping the ledger on her lap, we will call it consolidation. On paper, that was all it was, consolidation. In the ledger, next to each son as name, Temperance drew the same symbol 3 times over a braided ring she labeled oath. The clerk who witnessed it kept his eyes on the page and did not ask why her hand trembled only on Eli's entry. The servants in the hall counted the strikes of the long case clock and wondered why there were 13. The house changed. Doors you could swear had not been there opened onto rooms you did not wish to have to name. The nursery, long empty of toys, was fitted with locks that turned from the outside. The sewing room grew a second bolt. The cellar gained a new half-flight of steps ending at a wall of pine that smelled like fresh pitch. Temperance said these were economy's measures to protect a legacy in a season when men with ledgers in New Orleans swallowed families whole. She hung Josiah's watch on the bedpost and told the hands that any mouth that gossiped would go hungry. There were rules now. No lamps after 10 save in Mother's rooms. No unaccompanied walks to the creek. No singing in the evening unless it was hymn singing. and even then softly because grief dislikes competition. Thaddeus moved into his father's office, and the desk began to collect the kinds of papers that stain a life. Crop liens, promissory notes, invoices for laudanum and sulfur. Rowan went to the gin and learned how to listen to the gears like they were an old man telling a story he wasn't sure you deserved to hear. Eli floated as youngest sons do toward whatever edge felt most like air. The stories started small. A hand swore he saw Temperance in the graveyard at midnight, standing over Josiah S. Stone as if arithmetic could be done with bone. A stable boy claimed he heard whispering below the nursery, not the soft fall of prayer, but the choked-up rhythm of a promise someone didn't want to make. The cook woke to find flour sifted in a tidy circle on the kitchen floor and no footsteps through it. In the ledger, a fine black script appeared between the lines, too neat to be casual, too small to be seen. Without putting your face where your shame ought to stop you. The house must be kept. The line must be kept. The debt must be kept. In town, men nodded at Temperance like she was weather. Women measured her from bonnet to hem and could not decide whether to hate or admire. The preacher visited twice and then not again. He left a Bible with a ribbon at the story of Lot and said the Lord's ways were not our ways. Temperance slid the ribbon out and burned it in the kitchen stove, watching the bow turn to a black wrinkle. At the end of October, the county assessor came upriver with more paper and a face like sour milk. He brought a telegram from New Orleans and a letterhead that made even brave men squint. "Balance is due, Mrs. Calder," he said. "Dead men's debts are living people's burdens." "Some burdens," Temperance said with that slow mouth of hers, "make a back proud to carry them." She signed. She did not flinch at the number. That night the clocks, every clock in hall and parlor and gin, struck 13. The hands, counting out of habit, forgot to stop. Rowan, woken from a dream he would never name, found Eli in the hallway with a candle guttering between his fingers, murmuring to the dark like it would answer if he fed it gentleness. "What did Mother write under your name?" Rowan asked, voice caught between worry and contempt. "Promises," Eli said. "The kind that close a door." "You are grown," Rowan said. "Rough. You can refuse. In this house," Eli smiled without humor, "no one refuses. We just say yes slowly." On the first Sunday of November, Temperance stood her sons at the head of the table again. 3 empty chairs stood opposite them as if guests had sent their regrets. She placed the ledger on a stand like a missile. "Do you accept your father's offices?" she asked, and the pause lived longer than the rest of the sentence. Thaddeus said yes like a nail going home. Rowan said yes like a man lighting his own fuse. Eli said yes like a boy stepping down into cold water. In the hall, the long case clock's guts hiccuped. Somewhere below their feet wood creaked the question the county never dared ask out loud. And in the ledger, beneath those neat black rings, one more line of that too small script wrote itself like frost blooming on a window. Marriage of the house. We will talk about what that means. We will talk about the rooms behind the rooms and the winter the Calder place banned mirrors and why no one in Grafton County will drink creek water after dark. By the time the neighbors learned how the widow had reorganized the house, it was already too late to call it gossip. The dining chair at the head of the table stayed empty set each night with the dead man's plate. Knife turned inward, wine left to darken while 3 chairs beneath it shifted according to her hand. One evening the eldest sat nearest the head, jacket pressed, hair parted like a magistrate. The next night the middle son wore their father's signet ring on a silk cord. The youngest, always last, learned to answer when she called the husband his name without flinching. She did not need to say why. The house announced it in the ways a body does, the study that never locked for them anymore. the master key now hanging from the widow's wrist by a rosary chain. The ledger open on the escritoire, showing columns of cotton tallies beside birth weights written in the same ink, same steady hand. The widow taught them their father's rounds. The eldest took the accounts. The middle walked the rows with the overseer at dawn, tasting a seed and naming rain by noon. And the youngest, God save him, slept on a cot outside her door, told to keep the hall like a husband would. He learned the sound of her breathing through wood and paint. He learned to wake before her feet touched the floor. In a county that measured goodness by distance from the truth, the widow stood too close to hers. She kept a mirror room where guests were never invited. Glass on 3 walls and a narrow window that watched the river turn to mercury at dusk. Here the widow tested resemblance as though it were currency. She seated a son in their father's old coat and asked him to fold his hands, to set his jaw, to lift his left brow the way a man does when he is not buying. Blood is a stubborn river, she said to their reflections. It remembers its banks. When the mirror said no, she brought out the reliquaries, a brass pocket watch ticking a dead man's hour, a lock of hair tied with black thread, a legal paper stating land goes with line. The eldest could do the voice. The middle carried the man's scent in sweat and dust. The youngest had the hands broad, blue-veined, a little like a prayer turned over. She arranged them like offerings to a covenant nobody signed but everybody obeyed. At night she moved through the glass while the candles guttered, touching each cool pane with 2 fingers, naming ancestors the way some women named saints. If the mirrors complained, they did it softly, fogging at the edges as if the house itself had trouble breathing. Suitors came to call and found the road politely closed. The widow received them on the veranda with sugared tea and the kind of smile that promises forgiveness for any trespass as long as it is never attempted. She praised distant cousins and suggested nearer ones. She sent away a Charleston broker with a bouquet and a rumor neatly stitched. That her daughter-in-law must be of the line, old clay kin to the deed that made the fields so greedy for rain. She pinned her sons into a family shape that scared off outside names. The eldest slept in the master's room to keep the house brave. The middle wore the dead man's Sunday coat to church and signed papers with his initials. The youngest learned the schedule of candlelight under the widow's door and understood without having to be told in words a preacher would recognize where a stand-in is expected to stand. Nothing crude was spoken, but walls learned the grammar of footsteps. The floorboards learned too. They settled themselves for the weight of a husband on nights the husband had no body, only echoes and suns. The cotton turned peculiar the summer the cicadas rose like a plague. Bowls plumped in a hurry, then soured, whitening with a faint bruise at the seam as if each plant had been handled too hard. At dusk, the fields whispered. The gin throbbed after the belt stopped, slow and steady like a heart refusing to be pronounced. Men swore they saw the dead master at the far fence, hat in hand, face a blur behind heat, and they swore harder when they got close and found it was only the eldest, learning to wear distance like a mask. The widow walked the rows with her skirts gathered, lifting a bowl now and then and pressing it to her ear like a seashell. There, she whispered, as if the plant had given an answer. The middle son began waking with cotton lint in his throat, coughing up little white flags of surrender. In the quarters, prayers turned sideways, half to God, half to something that owns fields. The youngest, whose cot still lived by the widow's door, began counting her breaths again, aware how often a person who has everything forgets to inhale. The preacher learned which scripture she liked and preached it with a farmer's accuracy. "Tarry ye within thine own tent," he read, and smiled at the widow as though the verse had winked at her. Keep thy seed within thy borders. The congregation murmured the way a field murmurs when wind comes from the wrong direction. After service, the widow stood in the aisle and asked the reverend to witness a binding, a private covenant old as clay, sealed with a bloodline too dear to squander on strangers. He signed with a careful hand. He hummed through his nose to drown the sound of a page tearing out of an older book to make room for this one. The county clerk received a jar of early peaches at his window and a request to copy in the prettiest cursive he possessed a diagram of kinship that looped like a snake eating itself. He did not ask why a deed would need a family tree attached to it. He inked. He blotted. He slept that night with a taste of iron in his mouth. Midwives know the grammar of a house better than anyone. The one they called Sabina had been catching babies since the widow herself was nothing but breath and screaming. Sabina read quilts like other people read scripture, finger on the stitch, tongue against the back of her teeth when a secret turned up. She saw the pattern change under the widowess rule. Births closer in the branches than God ever intended. Names repeating until the cradle sounded like an old song. She kept a second ledger under the floorboard weights, dates, fathers that were more than fathers. In her ledger, the ink ran some nights as if the page itself were crying. Sabina visited the house with herbs for sleep, with vinegar for fever. She smelled the gin in the widowess hair, sharp and clean, a scent like a cut that isn't finished bleeding. "You fix your boys to their father's chair, miss," Sabina said one afternoon while the widow looked past her at the river. "Chairs break that way." "So do boys," the widow answered kindly. She always did. "Some things are too heavy to set down," she said. "The river will forgive me. It has blood that keeps land. Storms found the house easily that year. Thunder moved in like a boarder and made its rent by rattling doors. The youngest son kept watch on the landing where a man's shadow used to fall. He learned thunder didn't scare him. Silence did. One night between strikes, a clock somewhere down the hall hammered 11 in a tempo that didn't belong to the house. The youngest went toward it, bare feet remembering which plank sang, which went quiet like a lie. He found the study open and the glass of the bookcase fogged. The mirror room beyond held a stranger until the lightning confessed it was only himself thin, tired, wearing the dead man's posture like a borrowed coat. Behind his reflection, a second door showed itself, papered over but breathing. He pressed his palm there. The wallpaper warmed around his hand. The door's lock clicked like a throat swallowing. It opened to stairs that went down into a salt, cool dark, a dark that remembered footprints and asked for more. The cellar waited like a secret too heavy to haul up. The youngest followed the stairs by touch, counting each board like a prayer bead. At the bottom he found shelves of jars, pickled peaches, ledger books wrapped in oilcloth, teeth in a box that pretended to be cedar. There was a table with a vise for mending tools that had once been a birthing bed because the wood remembered how to cradle. On the far wall, ink had bled into plaster and an accidental family tree names layered until the letters ghosted. Mother into wife, uncle into father, cousin into child. In the center of the room, a chair weighted with leather straps meant for sharpening knives and other things people never name aloud. The youngest ran a finger along the seat and came away with dust, lint, a long pale hair that never belonged to him. Words rose behind him like a tide. "You shouldn't be here." It was the eldest, lantern lowered to keep the light from waking the wrong truth. "She keeps that door shut for a reason." The youngest lifted the lantern higher. The light found a shape on the wall. The deed itself, sketched as a map of blood. "For land," he said. "For cotton." The eldest didn't deny it. He set the lantern between them and blew it out. Leaving a house like that is harder than prayer. The youngest tried twice. The road turned him around once with a rain so sudden it erased direction, the second time with a loose wheel that rolled into the ditch like a coin down a throat. He came back soaked, then muddy, then laughing without humor the way people laugh when laughing is the last polite thing left. Sabina met him in the passage by the pantry with a tin of salve and a folded scrap of her ledger. "You think the door keeps you?" she asked. "You are the door." He started to answer, and didn't he? She showed him a quilt block, a pattern of crossed bars and little squares like windows. "Courthouse steps," she said, a whisper so the walls wouldn't accuse her of teaching a map. "Turn it the other way and it's something else." He looked until the pattern shifted. A labyrinth. Fields. A plan. "Bring your brothers," she said, "or Dante. Some folk are too tied to the chair." He pocketed the pattern like a sin and went to find the eldest, who was in the gin house, counting bolts with the overseer and not counting the way his hands shook when he touched a belt. The widow began sleeping less, or if she slept, the house couldn't approve it. Candles burned down to the stamp of her initials. The youngest replaced them and learned to pretend he never had. The middle son took fevers at odd hours and sweated clear, as if nothing in him wanted to turn to salt. The eldest came to the study each morning with 2 accounts: how much the rain owed them, how much the river wanted. The widow signed both in the dead man's name. Her hand never wavered. When the circuit judge rode through on business, she entertained him with lemon cake and a view of the river where it bent like a hinge. He remarked on the health of her sons. "All so much of your husband," he said, unable to find a polite word for resemblance that wasn't the accusation. "That is the point of a dynasty," she said, and smiled the way a blade shines if you mistake it for water. After he left, she went to the mirror room and shut herself in. The boys listened. Mirror against mirror made a tunnel where a person could walk forever and never become different. When she came out, her eyes were calm. "Harvest is early," she told them. "We'll bring the fields in close." The fields did as they were told. Cotton came all at once like a confession. Hands bled, sacks filled. The gin sang itself hoarse. The widow took her ledger to the cellar and made columns. Pounds, bales, cousins' births due before frost. The youngest followed when she forgot to lock the secret door and stood very still behind the stair when he heard voices not hers. Men with courthouse voices spoke from the far corner, lawyer ink in their tongues. "The patent S language is plain," one said. "The land legacy follows the undiluted line. Marriages out of parish void the claim. But a household united counts as one flesh, the other finished, the way a man prays when he doesn't believe and hopes God is tired." "You keep your circle tight, missus," the first voice said. "You keep the world out and the deed can tell there's a difference." Paper rustled. Wax hissed under a signet. Footsteps went away. The youngest moved then, shaking hard enough to rattle the glass. On a shelf he found a red ribbon around a packet of letters. His father writing to the widow when they were both too young to know how words can rot if you save them in air. There were phrases a son should never read. There were names doubled on themselves until they were no longer names, just a loop you couldn't climb out of. The day the house tried to swallow itself, dawn came in a color nobody agreed on. Some swore green. Some said the sky looked like milk left too long in a pail. The youngest woke on his cot to the sound of the gin belt turning when no one had thrown the switch. He ran, following the widow-s breathing through hallways he knew better than his own mind, until he reached the landing and saw the mirror room burning with daylight. The widow stood in the center, her dress a formal mourning black that gleamed like water in a well. The eldest flanked her, face set. The middle swayed as if the floor moved. "IV kept us," she said. "I've made what was owed stay put. The land knows its name because I taught it ours. This is how you keep a country from taking everything by becoming the thing it wants. By tightening until no finger can pry you apart. She reached for the youngest. Sabina stepped between like a wall built overnight. No more bindings, the midwife said, voice low and large. You can keep land and lose your soul. Or you can let the river have what it's always owned. The gin belt shrieked. The house leaned. In the cellar, jars broke like bad promises. The youngest held up the quilt square and saw a map where he used to see a prison. Turn it, Sabina whispered. He did. Corridors changed. Doors appeared where wall had been. The mirrors cracked from the corners, hairlines first, then branching. The widow lunged to catch the largest pane before it fell, and the glass took her with it slow as a dropped plate that hasn't decided whether to shatter. In the second it took to choose, the eldest chose too. He missed her hand by the width of a ring. The pane went down. So did she. They pulled what they could from the wreck, ledgers that burned too quickly to save, letters that smoked themselves into ash, a deed that turned to paste in the youngest's wet hands. The house didn't stop breathing until there was almost nothing left to breathe with. By dusk, the fields looked ordinary again, rows of white like laundry on a line. The brothers stood in the yard, each of them lighter by one weight and heavier by another. Sabina handed the youngest her ledger. You carry this, she said. Tell it straight when the time comes, not with a preacheress voice, with your own. He nodded, and for the first time since his father's name became a hallway instruction. He felt the floor stop, insisting he was a door. Years later, a surveyor's boy would find a rusted signet ring at the bend in the river and swear the metal had a pulse. A clerk's granddaughter would open a biscuit tin in a hen house and find Sabina's quilt block folded under a wedding veil. Pattern squares turned like a hand had taught them. A courthouse file would be missing a page and nobody would admit which page it was. Stories would leak the way houses do. A little each season, then all at once when a storm finds the right seam. Some versions would say the widow drowned in the gin pit. Some that she walked into the river and the river opened its books to take her name off. The brothers' faces would fade to a kind of likeness you can only see in glass right before it fogs. What do you think happened in that mirror room? Did the deed ever really hold the land, or did the land hold them and let go when the story finally did? If you know an older version of this tale, if your grandmother kept a square of cloth with a pattern you couldn't quite read, tell me. Leave your theory, your family rumor, your proof. And if this kind of dark history wrapped in a ghost story is your thing, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Tales Never Told, tap the bell so you don't miss the next descent into what polite history forgets, and share this with someone who likes their mysteries whispered through walls. These voices mattered, these patterns mattered. We keep them alive by telling them together.